friend Rachel and I decided to turn January into mending month. We like the idea of starting 2021 off by fixing things, and we kind of hope that it would become a metaphor for the entire year, but also because mending is just one of those things that sits around until it never gets done. I have a bunch of different stuff to mend, so I decided to do some research first. And I discovered that if you type mending into Google, the whole first page of hits is dedicated entirely to the mending enchantment in Minecraft, which I thought was fairly illustrative of the position of mending in our modern Western society, that is to say, swept under the metaphorical rug of technology. Interestingly though, mending in Minecraft is, and I quote, one of the most powerful enchantments that essentially allows players to restore the durability of certain items and make them stronger with the help of experience orbs, which I thought was pretty cool because it makes me imagine that when I repair stuff, I'm performing a transformative magic that allows me to strengthen and customize objects based on my personal interaction with them and the world. It seems like in recent years there's been somewhat of a resurgence in repair work as people shift to a more sustainable mindset, but there is literally nothing new about mending. It is just one of those things that has been around forever and nobody talks about because it is utterly lacking in glamour, which is somewhat understandable, but also because the work itself can be invisible. I was reading an article about Indian menders called Rafugars. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right, but they specialized in completely invisible textile mending, and there's actually not a lot of documentation on them because their work was so invisible that the people themselves just faded into the woodwork, despite the fact that what they did required tremendous amounts of skill. The British government had a pretty good go at popularizing mending as a patriotic act during the Second World War with their Make Do and Mend campaign, but since the advent of fast fashion, most people just haven't bothered. I think the last 50 years is kind of the first time in history where we can all just afford to replace our old stuff with new stuff. The catch of that being that the industry has since shifted to manufacturing objects that aren't durable, yet aren't meant to be repaired, yet still aren't made of materials that reflect their short lifespan, and then they end up sitting around forever in landfills. I think there's also something to be said about the importance of objects and the meaning that they impart. For example, the idea of a family heirloom that's passed down through generations, or I think all of us have that one pair of jeans that's basically been through the blender and we're still wearing. If we think more about the meaning and usefulness of objects, and less about the monetary value placed on them by an industrial and impersonalized market, I think that gives us way more incentive to cultivate interactive and therefore meaningful relationships with them through their care and repair. I think a lot of us now have been born into this world of IKEA furniture where everything is new and shiny and perfect all the time, and things that are used aren't considered as valuable unless they're classified as rare one-of-a-kind antiques, which to me is sort of backwards because doesn't the sheer fact that an object is used inherently give it status as an object of value? Back to mending being nothing new. The Japanese have amazing models for these ideas with concepts like wabi-sabi, which is a mindset that embraces imperfection. Kintsugi, the technique of using gold to repair broken ceramics, after which they are actually considered more valuable. And then what I'm most interested in for this particular video, sashiko and boro, which both have to do with visible textile repair. There's starting to be a bunch of pockets on the internet now about visible creative mending, and sashiko is kind of like the rock star of these pockets. Project number one is this cushion. I'm not quite sure what I'm looking for here, but I'm going to definitely take a look at all of the upholstery fabrics. This is upholstery fabric in here. The cushion itself, I'm fairly certain, is covered with linen. That thing is so threadbare, it might be a really good idea to cover it with something a little bit more durable than what it had. So the idea is that I'm going to stick this piece of cloth underneath and then sew it with this sashiko style of doing things. I want it to wrap around the front of the cushion because there are also a couple holes in the front. I don't want to totally obliterate these parts because they still kind of hold it together. I think that will also make my life easier if you're working with something that's flat. Sashiko patterns can get super intricate and complicated and really lovely, but I've never tried to do something like this before, so I'm going to try something relatively simple. From what I saw on the internet, it looks like transferring the actual design onto the fabric is part of the whole deal. I don't really care about being so exact, so I'm going to try and freehand it, also because drawing on this would be kind of annoying. I have this, I think it's like a pearl cotton type, I don't really know exactly what traditional sashiko thread is, but supposedly this is a totally acceptable thing to use, and I'm not really a stickler for traditions that I don't know anything about, Sashiko means little stabs, so that's what I'm going to be doing for the next several hours. And boro is the result of doing sashiko a lot, so that the textile itself just becomes a patchwork of different fabrics. I'm going to do my experiments on this front edge. I think there's a fancy way to tie your thread in without a knot, but because it's thick fabric, I'm just going to tie a knot and be done with it. The idea is that one should get the stitches as even as possible. That's not an even stitch at all. So I've definitely created more beautiful things, but I also think that was the hardest part of it because it had this like foam layer underneath it that made it really hard to stitch through. I think I'm going to take a completely different approach than what I was originally planning, because if this were a normal like sheet of fabric that I could easily get my hands under, I would be more than happy to like print a pattern on top of it. But because this is a cushion, it's super tricky to get my stitches even because I can't really maneuver the needle very well around the cloth. I think I'm actually going to cut this section out entirely because I discovered with this little bit in front that the raggedy little edges are just way more trouble than they're worth. And then I think I'm just going to totally freehand funny shapes all over. And that way I don't have to worry about intersecting lines being clean. Okay. This thing has actually gotten to the point where I think I could start to sit on it. It's a little bit strange. I really wish that I'd started with the circles. The least attractive part of this for me is the way that this is cut out. I'm gonna continue to put more circles on these little patches over here. I think I'm gonna call this done. All of the most important bits, like this one over here, I actually went over twice. That's done, and then there were cracks up here that were also important to get done. And then I figured that if I ever have more, that I can just add some more circles and cover those up too. 3 guesses what the next project is, and the first 2 don't count. Socks. I have a whole bucket full of them. I'm going to show 3 different ways to darn socks. The first one is the very standard one. I have a tennis ball, but I've also used oranges and apples. Now I have this official sock darning thread, which is 25% polyamide and 75% wool. Most sock yarns used for knitting are also 25% polyamide. It's a synthetic fiber, but it makes it slightly more durable. You could probably do this with normal thread too. I just like the wool because it felts together with time, and so it feels a little bit more sock-like on your feet than like a standard cotton thread would. I've gotten to this point. There's still a lot of holes in here, so I've started going back over it and just weaving in some more strands. This is kind of why I don't like this method. I find it super messy and imprecise. That's probably because I'm not that good at it. Voila, darn sock. So one of my things about this method is that I can kind of feel the edges where I had to stitch into them so many times. But that does not happen on this next method. So this is by far my preferred way to darn socks. I usually aim to do it the long way like this as opposed to going like this because I find it keeps a better shape. All I have to do to start it is take a tiny little stitch there and I pull it across and I leave the tail across here. I'm doing this like half hitch thing. So I start with a needle pointing towards me and I just take a little stitch in the top and pull it through and it catches on itself. It's kind of like blanket stitch or chain stitch if you're doing embroidery. And then I go across the entire thing like that. One of my favorite things about this method is that I can weave in the ends as I stitch. So already by the time I get to the end of that, I can already cut that tail off if it's in my way because it's already secured in the stitches that I just made. So there's no going back and weaving in ends like I had to do with the other method. When I reach the end of this row, I'm just going to take a little stitch and not pass through it, just so it anchors it to the other end of the hole. And then I will go back and do the exact same thing in reverse across by looping my needle through the chain that I already created. Another cool thing about this method is that it's really easy to change the shape of what you're stitching. For example, like this hole kind of like curves up and around, right? So with the other method, because I'm going back and forth like this and then back and forth like this, at some point you're just going to be crossing over parts that you don't really need to, which is fine, but might as well be efficient about it. But this one I can just really form to the hole that already is there. I find that it gets so much less bulky around the edges. There's just the one little stitch at the beginning of each row on either side. So for this last method, this gets a little bit trickier. This is a sock that my grandmother knit. So for this one, I'm going to use a technique that's called Swiss darning. I want to recapture all of these stitches that have come out of place. So because this is a hand knit sock, I actually know what sort of yarn was used. And I went digging in my stash and I found a piece of yarn left over from a sweater that I made that I remember was officially called sock yarn, which means it's ideal for this. It just so happens to match the sock really well. I'm going to follow the line of existing stitches. I'm trying to figure out exactly how this works. How many rows am I missing? Looks like 2 and kind of a half. I'm developing a new trick that makes way more sense to me than what I just did. I'm actually going to use a knitting needle to hold the stitches open that I've just created instead of using another piece of thread. There's so much going on here. Why is this so confusing? Maybe I'm making this like way more complicated than it should be, but it makes the most sense of anything to me to actually stick 2 knitting needles in here and knit like normal, because that's basically what I need to do. Picked up stitches top and bottom now, and I'm just gonna Kitchener stitch them together and hope that does the trick. I hate not being able to see anything! Hallelujah. Here it is, finally. That gave me way more trouble than it should have, but it is done, and it doesn't look too bad. I would say without the black stripe, you could probably not even tell that it was there. Well, sort of. I finally finished the very large pile of socks. Some of them are more darn than sock, but hopefully I will not have to darn socks for a while now. This means that I can move on to the next project. Jeans. I've never really attempted to repair jeans. I've been very intimidated about it because I'm kind of finicky about how my clothes feel on me. So I've kept these 3 pairs of jeans that I've had since I was like 14, ripped in my drawer for years. All of them are ripped pretty much in the same place. And this pair also has a rip in the front knee, which I think I would like to do by a nicer sashiko pattern than the one that I used on the chair. I am going out to match my jeans to thread so that when I sew over this hole, it will be as invisible as possible. I managed to find a bunch of different colors of thread that matched the jeans pretty closely. So I'm going to start with the pair of jeans that I care least about so that by the time I get to the one that I actually want to save, I might know what I'm doing. I also got some iron-on interfacing. I'm going to put this on the inside of the jeans as a backing. Oh, I think I want the entire area from like here to here to be covered. I had to look up which side of the interfacing to use because I actually have never used this stuff before. And it is the bumpy side that I have to put down to the fabric. So I'm going to turn these inside out, sticky side down, fuse my interfacing. Uh-oh, that's hot. Cool. Now I have lovely patches on the inside of my pants. So there's multiple kinds of sewing machine feet. I don't know very much about them, but I know that there is a darning foot. I think a lot of people use like a free motion quilting foot for denim mending. You can do it with any foot, but I actually wanted to look in my manual because I don't know anything about these different kinds of feet that are in here with the machine. Sewing feet 18. A darning foot. This is known as the darning foot. Every time I use this thing, I have to learn something new about it in order to make it work. Aha. How does this even work? Uh-huh. Ah! Okay, hold on. I'm doing this wrong. Over, like, that makes a lot more sense. There we go. All right, now I have a darning foot. I have threaded my machine with kind of like a medium tone thread. These jeans are darker than the ones that I matched to, but I matched to the ones that I most wanted to look invisible. I'm just going to go back and forth. Interesting. Ooh, okay. Well, that seems to be working. So basically the idea is just that I go back and forth over this like a bajillion times until you can't even see the tear anymore, as long as I keep going with the direction of the weave. So I'm just going to speed this up a little bit. I think the idea with the darning foot is that you can kind of move around a little bit more than you can with a regular foot. Cool. First pass. Definitely I need a darker color, but wow, okay, I can totally see how this is going to be invisible if you do it properly. This is so cool. Things I'm figuring out as I go along. It's important not to pull too hard on the jeans because otherwise the machine makes little loops, like you pull too hard on the stitches and then they look less even. I'm also having a tendency to like go a little bit on the diagonal just because it's on the seam. And I think it would look better if I kept it really straight along the grain. But other than that, I'm really impressed. Well, let me rethread the machine with a different color. I used 3 different colors on these jeans. And I'm going to call them done because the fabric is actually getting pretty stiff from my stitching back and forth. This side I just used one of the colors on because it didn't actually have a hole, but I wanted to reinforce it anyway because I knew it was going to rip soon. And it's pretty invisible because the color match is really close, but this side is the one that actually had the hole, and I went a little crazy. I definitely should have used a darker one to begin with, and I shouldn't have used the darkest one. The other thing about this that is bugging me is that I'm using polyester thread on cotton pants, and that just feels really weird. Not like from the texture, but mentally, I guess, because I know that cotton is going to wear a lot differently than polyester. So I definitely feel the patches, but you don't really see them. They're a little bit stiff, like I can definitely feel that there's more resistance in those particular places. But wow, I'm actually really impressed. I was worried that they were going to be baggy, but it looks like it actually did the opposite and kind of like pulled stuff back together. I'm wondering also if they'll get softer with time, and that's partly why I want to do it with cotton, is because I know that cotton will soften like jeans with time. The place where I felt the interfacing the most is really down here, which I don't think I can do much about. I think the thing to do on the next one would be to actually sew as few stitches as possible because I think it's just the sheer volume of it that makes it really stiff. Next time I'll just take it a little bit slower with the colors and I'll mix them more evenly. Yesterday I went on this big long epic quest for cotton thread and this is all I found. So I don't think I'm going to be able to do all of it with cotton, but I did also pick up some thin cotton denim. I wanted to try this because the interfacing is actually made to make stuff a little bit stiff. I'm going to pin this in place and sew around it as my backing. I'm hopefully not going to make this super wrinkly and stuff. It's just really hard to get this to lie flat. The advantage of the interfacing was definitely that. Do I want to continue this or do I abort mission? Okay, it's not that bad. I put the cotton thread in the top, but I kind of feel like it's thicker than the polyester thread, which doesn't really work in my favor. And also, I think it messes with the tension of things. I think just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to put the polyester thread back in. Yeah, the two threads feel totally different. Okay, wrestling take 2. Aha! This one's fine, but I actually have to cut this patch so that it actually goes up here, because there's also a very thin spot here. But I am already a bit more of a fan of this texture than the interfacing that I had worked with. Alright. These feel the best of all of them for sure. I think because I went much lighter on the stitches, they feel totally fine, like I never even patched them in the first place. Mission accomplished. I never thought that was possible. I have one more rip to mend in these, and it's in the knee, so it's not quite as structurally important. This time I actually do want to do the real technique where you draw it out onto the fabric. So I found this pattern online that I'm just going to quick copy onto this graph paper so that I can transfer it over to the jeans. I had a heck of a time trying to transfer this design over to the jeans. I tried transfer paper, didn't really see anything at all. I guess I could have tried a different color, but I thought that bright pink would definitely show up well in blue. Then I tried poking holes in this grid paper so that I could press my marker through the holes and have at least the grid. Usually people do this with like a powder or something, and it's called pouncing. But the only powder that I had available to me was flour, and I didn't think that was going to stick very well. So then I just ended up taking a ruler and making grid lines on the jeans. That looks like this. I'm just going to go back in and weave in all of these little ends now. The patch is finished. I have now mended 3 pairs of jeans, count them 1, 2, and 3, this cushion, and a whole bucket load of socks, which was the extent of my mending pile until I went under my bed looking for something else, and I found this, which is a whole nother bucket of socks. So I guess the sock mending is not over. I'm a huge fan of this pair of jeans that I did the sashiko patch on. I really feel like these jeans now have like this character that they didn't have before, and it makes me want to wear them more. And before, they weren't really my favorite pair of jeans, but I have to say, out of all of the jeans that I've mended, I'm wearing what was my favorite pair, but I think that this ended up being my favorite pair. I've also really enjoyed sitting on this cushion, surprisingly. I like the texture of it a lot. I really don't mind the look of it in the end, because it kind of just becomes part of what it is. Back to sock mending.